The auction gavel slammed down with a thud that echoed through the marble halls of the First National Bank. The executives in the front row smiled, shaking hands and clinking glasses of cheap champagne. They had just pulled off the heist of the century, or so they thought. They had just sold the abandoned, overgrown 400-acre Blackwood Estate to a quiet, unassuming local mechanic for a staggering $300,000 over its appraised value. To the bank, the land was a toxic asset, a massive tax liability covered in rusted machinery, sinking mud, and a dark history that had kept it stagnant on their books for 3 decades. They celebrated the massive windfall, treating the buyer like a fool who had just signed away his life savings for a graveyard of worthless dirt. But their smiles would vanish exactly 48 hours later. Because the bank had spent 30 years looking at the topsoil, completely blind to what the eccentric original owner had sealed 60 feet beneath the limestone bed. When the vault door was finally cracked open, the executives realized they hadn't just sold an old farm, they had accidentally handed over the keys to a fortune that could bankrupted their entire institution. Arthur Pendelton was not a man who made impulsive decisions. For 40 years, he had run a modest diesel repair shop at the edge of town, his hands permanently stained with grease and his eyes sharp from decades of peering into broken engines. Everyone in the county knew Arthur as a quiet, hard-working widower who lived frugally and kept to himself. When he showed up at the bank's high-stakes real estate auction, wearing his faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots, the pristine suit anti-executives chuckled under their breath. They assumed he was lost, or perhaps looking to buy a tiny plot to park junked cars. The Blackwood Estate was the crown jewel of the bank's toxic asset list. It had belonged to Silas Blackwood, a reclusive industrialist who vanished in the late 1980s under a cloud of federal investigations and conspiracy theories. The bank had foreclosed on the property after years of legal gridlock, eager to wash their hands of it. The rumors claimed the land was cursed, barren, and utterly useless for development due to strict environmental zoning. When the bidding opened, the bank's regional vice president, a ruthless man named Richard Sterling, expected a struggle to even meet the reserve price. But Arthur raised his paddle immediately. Every time an out-of-town developer bid, Arthur raised his paddle without emotion. He pushed the price higher and higher, forcing the developers to back down, until the hammer fell. As Arthur walked up to sign the deed, Richard Sterling leaned over with a smug grin. "Congratulations, Mr. Pendleton," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're officially the king of a mountain of dirt. I hope you enjoy the property taxes." Arthur simply nodded, signed his name with a cheap plastic pen, took the heavy iron keys, and walked out into the rain. The bank immediately threw a private party in the executive lounge, celebrating the massive quarterly profit. They thought they had swindled an old mechanic. But Arthur knew something the bank's modern computers and fancy surveyors had completely missed. 3 weeks prior, while repairing an ancient, rusted bulldozer that had been dragged off the Blackwood property by a local scrapper, Arthur had discovered a hidden compartment beneath the operator's seat. Inside was a leather-bound journal written by Silas Blackwood himself, dated 1987. The journal contained meticulous geological charts, structural engineering blueprints, and a terrifyingly precise set of coordinates. Silas hadn't lost his fortune before he disappeared. He had consolidated it, converted it, and buried it. The morning after the auction, before the bank's wires had even fully cleared, Arthur rented a heavy-duty industrial excavator and drove it onto the overgrown property. He didn't clear the weeds or look at the dilapidated mansion. Instead, he drove deep into the dense woods, following the coordinates from the journal to a massive, naturally occurring sinkhole masked by decades of thick briars and fallen timber. Working alone in the damp earth, Arthur used the excavator to clear away hundreds of tons of jagged limestone boulders. By hour 6, the steel teeth of the excavator bucket struck something that didn't sound like rock. It was a dull, metallic ring that vibrated through the ground. Arthur climbed down into the muddy pit with a shovel, scraping away the dense clay to reveal a massive, reinforced steel hatch, completely uncorroded, bolted directly into the bedrock with military-grade seals. Written across the face of the hatch were the words, "Property of the Federal Reserve Bank, Transit Vault 12B." The heavy steel hatch didn't just contain Silas Blackwood's missing millions, it contained a financial ticking time bomb. When Arthur cleared the mud from the secondary digital locking mechanism, he realized the vault was still drawing low-voltage power from an abandoned underground grid. The bank had assumed the estate was a dead asset, but beneath their feet, a mechanical countdown had been running for 30 long years. If Arthur opened it incorrectly, an automated security protocol would flood the subterranean chambers with corrosive acid, destroying the contents forever. If he opened it correctly, he would expose a dark financial secret that the First National Bank had spent 3 decades trying to bury. As Richard Sterling sat in his air-conditioned office, sipping his morning coffee and looking at the closed file of the Blackwood sale, his desk phone rang. It was the bank's chief compliance officer. His voice trembling so violently he could barely form a coherent sentence. They had just discovered an old, unindexed archival ledger from 1988, and realized exactly what they had just sold to the old mechanic for pennies on the dollar. Imagine holding a piece of paper that could completely erase the wealthiest institution in your city. What would you do? Would you walk into the CEO's office and demand a ransom, or would you quietly unearth the truth and watch the dominoes fall? Comment below with how you would handle finding a lost federal vault on your property. If you've ever found something unexpected buried in your own backyard, even if it was just an old coin or a time capsule, let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button right now, because the twist coming up next reveals exactly why the bank panicked, and you won't want to miss how Arthur plays his final hand. Before we unlock the final chamber of the Blackwood Vault, make sure to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turning on notifications ensures you're always the first to witness these incredible, true-to-life historical mysteries as they unfold. As the compliance officer explained the nightmare over the phone, Richard Sterling's face drained of all color. The First National Bank hadn't always been an independent local entity. In the late 1980s, it had served as a primary clearinghouse and emergency repository for the Federal Reserve during a period of intense economic restructuring. Silas Blackwood wasn't just a reclusive eccentric, he had been the bank's chief custodian of physical assets. When the Federal Transit vaults were decommissioned, a massive shipment of unrefined, high-purity silver bullion and historical bearer bonds had been routed through Blackwood's estate for temporary storage. When Blackwood vanished, the bank's leadership at the time panicking over a massive audit, falsified the records, claiming the assets had been transferred back to the Central Treasury, while quietly searching the surface of the property for years. Finding nothing, they eventually assumed Blackwood had stolen the wealth and fled the country. They forgot that Blackwood was a master engineer who built downward, not upward. By selling the land to Arthur with all mineral, subterranean, and historical salvage rights fully transferred, the bank had legally signed away over $400 million in physical bullion and legally binding, non-callable bonds. Back at the sinkhole, Arthur referenced the leather journal one final time. He bypassed the corrupted digital keypad entirely, using a manual hydraulic jack to apply pressure to a specific relief valve hidden behind the vault's outer hinges, just as Silas had instructed. With a deep, echoing hiss of compressed air, the heavy vacuum seals ruptured. The massive steel door swung outward, revealing a concrete staircase leading down into the darkness. Arthur turned on his flashlight and descended. Rows of pristine, wooden crates lined the subterranean vault, completely untouched by moisture or time. He pried open the nearest crate. Inside, stacked in flawless, gleaming rows, were 100-ounce bars of physical silver, stamped with the federal seal of 1985. Beside them sat waterproof cases filled with perfectly preserved, bearer bonds. Arthur took a single silver bar, walked back up to his truck, and drove straight to the First National Bank. He walked past security, marched directly into Richard Sterling's executive suite, and placed the heavy silver bar right on top of the vice president's mahogany desk. "I think you left something in my backyard," Arthur said quietly. The bank offered to buy the land back for 10 times what he paid, but Arthur just smiled, turned around, and walked out. He was no longer just a local mechanic, he was now the absolute owner of the very institution that had tried to make him a fool.